In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the new input control types provided by HTML5. The example is input control tags.html. It's in your project files folder. I'll open it in Chrome first of all. Chrome, unfortunately, doesn't support these controls particularly well. It just displays text boxes in some cases. So let's take a look at Opera. And Opera actually does a much better job of it. There's a date control type where you can choose a date, such as March the 1st. There's a time control type where you can enter a time in hours and minutes. There's a date time type where you can choose a date and a time zone. UTC means Universal Coordinated Time or Greenwich Mean Time. You can choose a whole month, such as April 2012. You can choose a week, such as week number 12. So these are a series of date time types. When I click submit, I have some script which just echoes the items I've selected in each input control. So let's take a look at the code for that in Komodo Edit. Now first of all, I've got some styles. The styles just set up the basic appearance for the web page. And then a little further on, I have some script. The first function gets called when I submit the first form, which contains the date time related controls. That's the first submit button there. And then I have another script function which displays all the information in the second form. And that contains miscellaneous controls such as numbers, URLs, email addresses, and so on. So that code is fairly straightforward. It just gets the value from each control. Let's take a look at the actual tags. So the first form is the one that contains the date time tags. And as you can see, it's quite straightforward. We have a series of input types for date, and for time, and for date time. There's also an input type called date time local if you're not interested in time zones. And then there's a type for month and a type for week. So it's worthwhile using these. Some browsers will give you a nice user interface, like Opera does, with these customized input control configurations here. In the worst case scenario, the worst you're going to get is text boxes. So you haven't lost anything, and it potentially will gain something by using these new types of input controls. Okay, so back into Opera. The second form contains numbers, a range, telephone number, email address, URL, color, and a search string. So let me show you what that looks like in Komodo Edit, and I'll pop back and forth into Opera as we go through, just to show you what the user interface looks like. So there's an input type where you can ask the user to enter a number. You can specify the minimum and the maximum values which are allowed, and the value that's selected initially, plus a step size. And it's like a spinner. So initially, it'll display 25,000. I can click the up button to go up, and it'll take me up to the maximum, which is 50,000. And it stops there. Even though I'm holding the button down, it stopped at 50,000. And likewise, I can go down. I'm holding the down button, and it'll take me down to the minimum value, which is 10,000. Now, you can enter values in the text box as well if you want to, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like so. The second one here is a range control, where you can choose a number between a minimum and a maximum, like that. So that's implemented as a range type. You can specify the minimum, the maximum, and the initial value that's displayed when the control is first made visible. Then there's a type where you can enter a telephone number, and an email address, and a URL. Now Opera doesn't really do much with those controls, it just displays them as text boxes. In this position, Chrome is actually more useful. If I take you into Chrome, Chrome actually validates the input for some of these controls. So first of all, I just enter a telephone number. It doesn't actually validate telephone numbers because the rules vary from one country to another. But it does validate email addresses and URLs. So for example, if I enter an invalid email address, AAA, and an invalid URL, BBB, when I click submit, it validates the email address and displays an error message. So I have to enter a correctly formatted email address. Now obviously it isn't validating whether it's an actual email address, it's just the format that it's checking here. So if I click submit now, it'll accept the email address, and now it's just complaining about the URL. So I'd have to enter a valid URL here as well. There we go. So that should now work. There we go. So it displays my selections from each of the text boxes. If I go back into the code, we have two more controls to discuss. There's an input type called color, where you can choose a default value initially. Chrome just displays it as a text box. We have to type the color in, like that. Opera, on the other hand, actually displays a color picker. So I've selected orange. I just click submit. This is the color that I've effectively chosen, expressed in hexadecimal format. Okay, so the last control type is the search string. With the search string, you give it a type of search. You can specify how many results to hold, and then you give it a unique name. Potentially, you might have multiple search strings on the web page. This just gives it the ability to store the searches that you've entered into this particular search box. Now, if I go into Safari, Safari actually implements this quite nicely. I'll enter a search string initially of Andy, and then I'll press the Enter key. This will simulate a form submission, so it's displaying the alert boxes now, representing my input in each field. But the interesting thing here is if I expand this, it has a list of my recent searches. So if I type in Andrew here and press the Enter key, again it's going to cycle through the alert boxes. And now it shows me the two searches. So it would store up to 3 searches, and I could clear the recent searches if I wanted to, in which case they've all gone. So that concludes the lesson. We've seen how you can have date-time selection, months and weeks, numbers, ranges, telephone numbers, email addresses, URLs, colors, and search strings. The user interface does vary from one browser to another, but don't let that stop you. It's well worth using these controls in case the browser provides some improved user interface and validates the input. And you're not going to lose anything, as we've seen, because in the worst case scenario, you're just going to have text boxes, which you would have had anyway. So it's well worth using these controls to make your user interface as good as you can for the user.